All right, class, welcome. Unit 5 is titled Crisis and Constitution. This is definitely going to be a two-part unit, if not three. It's a lot to get to here. So, after the treaty which ended the revolution and granted independence to the United States that we discussed at the very end of the previous video, there's decisions to be made, right? That now we might take for granted, but at the time were certainly not simple decisions. Um, So this first point is kind of reiterating something that I brought up last time that it definitely bears repeating. For a decade after independence, the revolutionaries were less committed to creating an American nation, a singular thing, than to organizing 13 separate state republics. And again, as I pointed out in the Declaration of Independence, the language is plural. These United States, right? The United States are. It was not looked at as a singular thing primarily, right? The states had a lot of independence, right? It was more a collection of things. And that was the dominant attitude for a very long time. Um, so one reason why they were hesitant to set up a big federal centralized system, and you should ask yourself how relevant, in your opinion, this concern still might be. They believed, meaning the people in charge of making these decisions after the revolution, believed that the United States was too sprawling. So pause there, ask yourself, is that still a concern? The United States is a huge country. It is much bigger now than it was back then. Is that a concern? Is the country too big to be coherently governed as one thing? That's a timeless question in the history of this country. Too sprawling, and its people too diverse to be safely consolidated into a single national republic. They thought 200 plus years ago that the country was too big and too diverse. Well, now the country is much bigger and much more diverse. All right, so the question remains, is it rational to think that we can govern one huge, insanely diverse country like we have as one thing when there's so many different things going on under that one umbrella term, the United States? So ask yourself if that's a timely concern, in your opinion. They feared too that the government of a large republic would inevitably grow indifferent to popular concerns, being distant from many of its citizens. This is a huge country, and basically the concern was that the more power was in the federal government, the further and further away the people were from their government. So think about the extremes now that I put on this picture. The federal government is centered in Washington, D.C., as you know, and Hawaii is a state, as you know. Wasn't back then, but now it is. Talk about being distant. Isn't Washington, D.C. quite distant from Hawaii? I mean, if you fly from Washington to California across the entire continent, you're still less than halfway to Hawaii. Hawaii's far away. It's out in the middle of the ocean. So the question is, do you think the average person in Hawaii, do you think people in Washington, D.C. understand what people in Hawaii think, what they need, what they want? Is it easy for people in Hawaii to get into contact with their government, which is like 7 or 8 thousand miles away? That might be a concern. It's easier now with our communication, but it's a concern, right? The first attempt at a national government was something called the Articles of Confederation. Didn't last very long, but it was kind of the first attempt to connect the independent colonies under one government. Provided for a government by a national legislature, so there's an idea of a Congress, but Congress could not levy taxes, they couldn't collect taxes or regulate trade. The power of the purse, that's the power to tax and spend money, rested entirely with the states. So the state of Rhode Island, the state of Massachusetts, the state of New York, they could tax you, but the United States government couldn't. And the final power to make and execute laws also was entirely with the states. So all the states had their own laws, as they still do. We'll cover that in the next unit. But the national government, under the Articles of Confederation, the original attempt at a national government in the United States, Congress couldn't tax people. Sounds good to me. They couldn't even pass laws. Now, if you're a government that can't pass laws or collect taxes, you're not a government. You're a bunch of people sitting around in a room talking. You have no power. So this didn't work because they were concerned about the government being too strong for reasons we just went over. That's fine. It's an understandable concern, maybe. But the problem basically is that they went way too far in the other direction to the point where the government was so weak that it essentially had no power. It was a joke. All right. So they realized that wasn't going to work. Another decision they had to make, remember I showed you that map in the end of the last unit with that treaty that ends the war. There is this huge new territory added to the United States, and they need to decide what to do with the territory. The Northwest Territory was part of that area. You can see it colored in there. So the first decision they make is how many states are we going to have? How big are they going to be? We're going to have one huge state, a bunch of tiny states. What are we going to do? And they decided to do between 3 and 5 states. They ended up with five that you can see there, roughly the size of some of the bigger original colonies, right? Much bigger than Rhode Island, of course. Everything's bigger than Rhode Island, but more on the scale of maybe Pennsylvania, that type size. So 3 to 5, they ended up with 5 states. You can see there. Also, what are they going to do about slavery? They outlawed slavery throughout the region, but they had fugitive slave laws. So slavery was illegal, but if slaves escaped into these new states, they would be returned into slavery. So if you look at, for example, Kentucky, Kentucky had slavery. If a slave escaped from Kentucky and fled into Ohio or Indiana, where slavery was illegal, that slave could still be captured and sent back into slavery in Kentucky, for example. In most of these states, they outlawed slavery, and that's great, but lest you think that that's because of some moral objection to slavery or out of empathy and respect for African Americans, that unfortunately was not the case. Look what else they did. Pass laws to exclude free blacks from settling there. So let's stipulate something. During this period of American history, if you are a black American, you are either a slave or you're not. Not all blacks were slaves, but look what they did. They outlawed slavery. Okay. They also outlawed free blacks from living there. So if you add those two things together, what is the practical effect of that? No black Americans were allowed under any condition to live in any of these states. And this is something that's very often misunderstood about this period of American history, especially in the North, in New England, in the Midwest. A lot of the history textbooks and just the culture in general has this attitude about slavery and the post-slavery era that racism was a Southern problem. And that's a ridiculous myth. Um, it's hard to argue that in this context, the Northwest Territory states, Michigan, Ohio, etc., They can say, oh, we weren't racist, we outlawed slavery. Okay, you also outlawed black people. So there's that. It's an important, unfortunate, obviously, but important issue for you to understand about this part of the country historically. Um, the next thing that comes up is what feminism wasn't a word back then, but we can, in retrospect, say this is maybe first wave feminism or kind of a prototype of what became known as first wave feminism. Uh, an idea that to us is entirely uncontroversial, unless, we live in Afghanistan. Uh, the proposition that girls should receive the same education as boys. Pretty unobjectionable now in this country. In some countries, not so much, including training in vocations for careers in medicine, politics, and business. Why? The logic is pretty straightforward. No woman should have to pin her hopes for financial security and making a good marriage. So education is a key to upward mobility. It is a key to financial independence. And in this case, Wollstonecraft and other early American female leaders made a very straightforward argument that since education is the key to upward mobility and financial independence, women being educated reduces the risk of them being trapped in an abusive marriage because of financial dependence, right? If a woman has no education and therefore no job prospects, it is much more likely that she would be trapped in an abusive marriage because just for practical financial reasons, right? She has no other options. But if she has independent earning power, the theory goes, and it makes sense, right? If you have financial earning power, you are less vulnerable to be stuck in a situation like that. So if we jump ahead to today, this is more true than ever in the United States. The majority of um, the majority of Americans are women for, if you think about it, basic biological reasons that we don't need to get into for the purpose of this course. But in any human population, unless there's manipulation, a slight majority of the population will be female. Um, but more to the point, the majority of um, college and university students today in the United States are female. And that would have been unheard of back then in this period, or even 40 years ago, right? So a lot of progress has been made on this front. One more sociological thing that they bring up is the issue of marriage. So earlier in a different context, we talked about birth rates, placement rate, things like that. And there's some correlation, some, not as much as there used to be, certainly, between birth rates and the issue of marriage. Now, in modern American context, for better or for worse, childbirth and marriage in the culture are almost entirely disassociated, right? The idea of people having children when they're not married, there's nothing in our culture, mainstream culture, there's nothing about that that's taboo or surprising at all anymore. The period we're talking about now, the revolutionary period, is a radically different period. All right, we just need to stipulate that. There were almost statistically almost no childbirth out of marriage. Today, the majority of children are born outside of marriage. That aside, the issue of marriage in general and divorce. After the revolution, many states made divorce easier, although it remained extremely rare. Okay, so a couple things about this. What do they mean by making divorce easier? Divorce historically was looked at as a contract. And when you enter into a contract, you can't just walk away from it because you don't like it. In business, you can't do that, right? Contract is binding unless one of the parties um, is shown to have violated the terms of the contract, right? So to get a divorce previously, you would have to prove some violation of the contract, abuse, abandonment, something like that. So it was relatively rare. Um, but I want to point out a couple things. Number one, states passed laws making divorce easier, but it remained rare. That's very telling. What does that tell you? If you pass a law to make something easier, but the frequency of that thing doesn't immediately go up, that tells you that there's a different reason why people aren't doing it, other than it's difficult, right? If something's difficult, maybe people don't do it that often. But if the government makes it easier and people still aren't doing it that often, what does that tell you? Well, there's another reason they're not doing it, other than the difficulty of the thing or the legality of the thing. And that reason was social stigma, taboo. For better or for worse, there was a dominant attitude in the United States during this period that divorce was it was taboo. It was a failure. It was a last resort, an extreme action that was very, very, very rare. It was really frowned upon. And now, of course, that taboo is largely gone. So now we see that divorce is much more frequent, of course, in the modern context. Um, so you can see here, this data starts in 1860, about almost 100 years after the period we're talking about, and look at how low the divorce rates were. Very low, right? And then they start ticking up, 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 up. Um, there's this huge spike during the late Depression, early World War II period, kind of an aberration. That's a traumatic time, right? There's going to be all kinds of societal unrest during periods like that. But then it drops right back down to the, predictable rate, right, during the 40s. And then in the 60s, as the laws become even more liberalized, and divorce becomes even easier to be granted, they institute in the 60s what's called no fault divorce, where no one needs to allege or prove any wrongdoing. You can just say irreconcilable differences, it isn't working out. And it's much easier to get a divorce. And there is where you see the rates just skyrocket, right? In the 60s and 70s, up to its peak right around, let's say, what's that, probably 1970-ish. And then it starts dropping a little bit. Now, in the modern context, I want you to understand something before we move on. The sociology of this is important, whether you care about it or not, whether you've ever thought about it, it does affect our culture in a major way. The divorce rate for the last 40 years has been going down, but that doesn't mean that more American adults are married. So how can these two things be true at once? The divorce rate has been going down for 40 years, but we've never had more children born out of marriage. How could that be? Because divorce rates going down, you would think that implies more stable two-parent households, right? Well, that's not why the divorce rate's going down. The divorce rate is going down because you can't get divorced if you never get married in the first place. You follow? So, for better or for worse, this is for you to assess, but the taboo against the cultural societal taboo and stigma against um, having kids out of marriage, that taboo is largely gone. So therefore, the divorce rate's going down, not because marriages are more stable, but because more and more American adults don't even bother to get married in the first place. And if you never get married, you can never get divorced. Makes sense? So today in the United States, the percentage of children born outside of marriage has never been higher. And there are social costs attached to that. It's measurable. The social science on it is quite clear. Growing up without two parents in the household is incredibly harmful to children. The data is overwhelming and kick you in the face obvious. All right. This trend in American history of people getting divorced and or not getting married in the first place before having kids is terrible for children. Statistically, okay, there are obviously millions and millions of examples of children born into single family households or after a divorce who thrive, as I'm sure many of you would fit into that category. And if you do, you should be proud of yourself because you've defied the odds. But the overall aggregate data is very clear. This trend is not good for kids. maybe it's good for adults, but this is one of those sociological things that you need to weigh. How do we make sense of this, right? Is this a problem in your opinion? The breakdown of, the old model of the nuclear family, does that even matter to you, or is that just an outdated, patriarchal, antiquated thing that we should have gotten rid of long ago? A lot of people feel that way, and that's fine. But it's a measurable, huge shift in terms of our society, right? The structure of the modern American family, for better or for worse, is not what it used to be, right? And we can see that not starting during the Revolutionary period, but we can see certain laws passed that eventually would set into event, or into motion rather, a chain of events that would lead us to where we are today. So again, I'm going to cut this into two. I'm going to pause when we're ready to get into the Bill of Rights, because that'll be an entire video on its own. Um, but some of the political decisions that had to be made. So the Articles of Confederation was way too weak. So people realize, all right, we need to do something a little more put together than a government that can't pass laws or tax. That's like, what's the point? Um, so they try again. And ultimately, this is what becomes the Constitution. Delegates came from all the states except Rhode Island, where champions of states' rights wanted nothing to do with the project to strengthen the national government. Rhode Island, as you know, was and is the smallest state, so they were nervous about a strong national government because they thought that such a small state like Rhode Island would be ignored or swallowed up by bigger neighbors, so they didn't want any part of having a strong national government. The most important divisions facing these men, these are the founding fathers who were getting together to figure out, how do we put together a coherent government here. Most important divisions, uh, number, they list two. The divisions between large and small states. I want to make clear that when they say large and small states, they're not talking about physical size necessarily. They're talking about population. Okay. In the modern context, for example, Rhode Island, again, teeny state, but Rhode Island has approximately 1 million people. There are, I would guess, at least 10, maybe 12 states in the United States, which are all bigger than Rhode Island by definition, that have fewer people. Montana is physically huge compared to Rhode Island. It's enormous, but Montana has half as many people. So when they say small states, they mean small population, not necessarily small size. So that's one division. And the division, of course, between states that were deeply invested in slavery and those that were not. Here's the compromise. Uh, States would be equally represented in the upper house of Congress, that's the Senate. So every state has two senators, regardless of how many or how few people live in that state. That satisfied the smaller states. So states without a lot of people, they have the same amount of senators as states with a bunch of people. So that reassures the smaller states that they won't be ignored. The larger states don't like that, but that's the nature of compromise. And then in the lower house, the House of Representatives, representation's apportioned to the population. So states with a lot of people get a lot of seats in the House of Representatives, and that reassures the larger states. All right, so I assume this is mostly review for you. All right. In the House of Representatives, the seats are based on population. So states without many people might only have one representative. States like California with tens of millions of people are going to have dozens of representatives. But then in the Senate, everyone has two senators, even if one state has 20 times as many people as the state next to it. All right, that was the compromise. The Constitution also limited the power of state legislatures. So we talked earlier about originally all the states could pass their own laws, and that remained true, but they made some exceptions. States couldn't do certain things starting during this period. States couldn't levy duties on trade. That's a fancy way of saying states can't tax things from other states. All right. We have one economy, in other words. If something is, if I go to the supermarket and buy, avocados that were grown in California, the state of California can't put an extra tax on that avocado just because I'm buying it in a different state, right? We have one economy. So no tariffs, no taxes on things if they cross the border between, Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Coining money, right? Again, we have one economy. We're not going to use different currency in different states. And conducting foreign relations. We have one country, we have one foreign policy. If we're at war, we're at war. We can't have some states deciding that, no, well, Massachusetts is at war with Germany, but Connecticut isn't. We can't do that. Right? And that's probably common sense, right? We have one country, you have one foreign policy, you have one economy. Acts passed by Congress were the supreme law of the land. So if the federal government, if the Congress passes a law, no state can have a law that contradicts it. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but in theory, if the federal government passes a law, the state of New York can't pass a law that goes directly against that, in theory. Uh, there are times that's violated, and we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the 10th Amendment in the next unit. Let me jump ahead. Okay, so we're going to do two more things, and then we'll pause for the segue into the Bill of Rights unit. Another thing that was decided when they're drawing up the Constitution is how to pick a president, and they come up with the Electoral College, which a lot of people have very strong feelings about. The so I want to point out a couple things about the Electoral College. On this map, so the president is not chosen by popular vote. I think you all know that. A lot of people don't like that. I totally get the argument. I want to give you a little perspective from each side of the argument. On this map, the numbers in each state represent the number of electoral votes. The electoral votes is based on how many seats they have in Congress between the Senate and the House of Representatives put together. So the numbers basically represent how many people are in the states. Basically, okay? So think about it. Every state gets two senators, right? So it's automatically every state has two electoral votes right there. And then plus the number of representatives, which is based on how many people. So look at Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, big states with very low populations. They have 3 votes each. What does that tell you? They have two senators because everyone gets two senators. But those states have such few people. Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas. If they have 3 electoral votes, that's because they have two senators and one representative. California, 55. They have two senators, just like everyone else, and 53 representatives. Wyoming has one representative in the House. California has 53. Because California has apparently 53 times as many people as Wyoming. So basically, these numbers of electoral votes do approximately represent how many people there are, right? California has a lot of electoral votes. Texas has a lot. Idaho, not so much. So for all of our history, it is very rare that the person that wins the popular vote loses the election. It's very rare. Okay. For the entire 20th century, it never happened once, for example. It's quite rare. It's happened basically 4 times. The reason people are thinking about it though in the 21st century is that it didn't happen at all in the 20th century, but then in the 21st century it happened twice. It happened in 2000 and in 2016. And in 2016, it was an extreme case relatively because not only did the person who lost the popular vote win the election, this being President Trump, but as you can see the numbers here, the popular vote, I mean, Hillary Clinton got approximately 3 million more votes than President Trump. That's a pretty big margin. Right, 3 million. I mean, that's not a couple, that's not 50,000. Like the 3 millions, you could argue that that's a lot from a certain point of view. Um, but Trump won the popular vote by actually quite a bit. It wasn't even that close. And so a lot of people got all up in arms. How could this happen? Okay, totally understandable, right? Wouldn't it be more rational just to have a popular vote? Get rid of all these numbers and all this nonsense and just count the votes, right? Totally understandable. I want to point out a couple things. The assumption that people have that if this map you're looking at here is from 2016, many people have an assumption that they don't even question. They just assume that if the 2016 election going into it, let's say the rules had changed and going into 2016, we had said no more electoral college. We're doing popular vote for president between, in this case, Hillary Clinton and President Trump. Don't assume that Hillary Clinton would have won. I mean, maybe she would have. We'll never know. But what I want you to think through is just a, hypothetical thought exercise. I'm not all that convinced that she would have won. I think it's 50-50. Now, how could that be? She got 3 million more votes. Of course she would have won, right? Well, I don't know. Here's what might happen if we got rid of the Electoral College, which, by the way, we're not getting rid of it. It's in the Constitution. I hate to break it to you, it's not going anywhere. But just as a exercise in, you know, creative thinking here to understand the hypotheticals. And by the way, to make an argument for getting rid of it, I can make an argument for getting rid of it that has nothing to do with if we got rid of it, Hillary Clinton would have been president. I'm not convinced that's the case. Here's what I mean. You've probably heard of swing states when we have a presidential election. The states that are going to be close, right? And everyone obsesses. It's usually four or five, six states. And many other states are totally ignored. California is totally ignored. They have 55 electoral votes. That's the most by far. You need 270 to win. And I'm going to bust out my calculator. I should be able to do this in my head, but I can't. You need 270 electoral votes to be elected president. California has 55. That's almost exactly a fifth. That's almost exactly 20% of the amount that you need to win. That's more than 20%. California has 20%, and everyone knows in the modern American political landscape, everyone knows the Democrats going to win California. Everybody knows. It's no debate. California is automatically going for the Democrats. They automatically have a 20% head start. Okay. And likewise, Arkansas is automatically going to vote Republican. Everybody knows it. So people ignore those states. A Republican is not going to campaign in California. That'd be a waste of their time. A Democrat is not going to campaign in Arkansas. That's going to be a waste of their time. You follow? Same thing with Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Everyone knows how these states are going to vote, so they're ignored by both parties. Is that good? Ask yourself, is that good for the country when like 40 plus states are totally ignored because everyone knows how they're going to vote anyway? They're just taken for granted. That's not great, right? Now, here's the thing. What if we got rid of all this? Well, and it was just straight up popular vote. You know what you would see? More people would vote, first of all. And second of all, the results might surprise you. Here's what I mean by that. In the context of the 2016 election, for example, California is going to automatically vote for the Democrat. Everybody knows it. However, California being so huge has more Republicans than any state in the country. They're the minority, but there's a ton of them. If we got rid of the Electoral College, conservatives in California would vote. Under the current system, if you're a conservative and you live in California, you know that your preferred candidate cannot possibly win the state of California. So why would you even bother to vote, right? People don't vote. If you're a liberal who lives in West Virginia, you know that your candidate can't possibly win. So you're not even going to bother to vote. But if you get rid of all this electoral college, all these numbers, all these state lines, just have one election with tens of millions of people voting, you would have conservatives in Massachusetts voting in huge numbers because all of a sudden someone's paying attention to them. You would have liberals in, Mississippi and in Oklahoma, some very conservative states, but there's a lot of liberals there. Wouldn't it be nice if their voice was heard? If their vote counted and it didn't matter what state they lived in. So in other words, you might see that if you get rid of the electoral college, President Trump could have easily won this election if it were based on popular vote because more conservatives in liberal states would have turned out to vote for him. It's possible, right? Obviously, we'll never know. So electoral college, people love to hate it. I totally get the argument against it. I'm just saying don't automatically assume that it would have radically changed the outcome of any election in which the winner lost the popular vote because people know the rules going in, right? The rules do decrease voter turnout for reasons I just tried to explain. But it's not going anywhere. It's in the Constitution, so let's move on. The last thing we'll cover here, very infamous part of the original Constitution, which is no longer in the Constitution. However, I think from a certain point of view, it might still be relevant in a different way. In the House of Representatives, the number of seats is based on how many people live in the state. We discovered that. So what about states back then with a lot of slaves? Well, the slave states wanted to count all their slaves because counting all their slaves would increase their population numbers and would give them more seats in Congress, more power in the federal government, and more electoral votes and more authority over picking the president. The states without a lot of slaves said, wait a minute, you can't do that. You don't treat these people as human beings. They're certainly not citizens. You can't get extra political power by counting slaves. That's just completely illegitimate. You can't do that. So the compromise, very infamously, was 3/5, 60%. So the states in the Deep South counted 60% of their slave population, and therefore the states with a lot of slaves got extra seats in Congress, and therefore extra power in the federal government, and therefore extra power in electing presidents. Now, after the Civil War and after slavery ended, this was deleted from the Constitution, and now all people are counted. We're not going to cover this in this course, but let me just point out something, a great tragedy. When they got rid of the 3/5 thing and said to the southern states after the Civil War, after slavery ended, you now can count 100% of your black population because slavery's over, right? So that meant the southern states, the former slave states, got more seats in Congress and more electoral votes for picking president because now they could count all Black Americans rather than 60%. But as you probably know, they didn't let the Black citizens of their states vote for 100 years, essentially. So tragically, after the Civil War, after slavery ended, the former slave states got more political power on the backs of African Americans who were not treated as citizens. So, another tragedy from our history. What I want you to consider, though, in terms of a possible connection to a current situation we're facing, is this specific issue of slavery, thank God, is off the table. It's like we don't need to worry about this anymore. But the overall question here is, do we have right now a huge number of people in this country who are not citizens and therefore cannot vote? And the answer, of course, is yes, we do. We have many, many millions of people in this country who are not citizens and therefore cannot vote. Okay. They're not slaves. They're undocumented immigrants. What's the connection? Are there certain states in the United States with disproportionately large numbers of people in their states who are not citizens and therefore cannot vote? Yes, there are. California comes to mind. Are those non-citizens counted for purposes of deciding how many congressional seats or electoral votes California, for example, gets? Are those non-citizens counted? Yes. Does California, therefore, get more political power in Congress and in picking presidents, 20%? Does California get more political power by virtue of counting people who are not citizens? Yes, they do. Do you see any connection here? There is a history in this country of certain political factions counting people who are not citizens and therefore cannot vote to give themselves, the politicians, more political power on the backs of people who can't vote. Now, the question is, in the modern context, let's say you have a congressperson representing a district in wherever, Texas, Illinois, wherever. You have a congressperson representing a district where a third of the people that live there are undocumented immigrants and cannot vote. Think about the incentive structure. Does that congressperson need to listen to the needs and wants of those people? Does that congressperson need to help those people or serve those people in any way? They can't vote. They can't vote for the congressperson, so he has no incentive to help them. They can't vote against the congressperson, so he has no concern about ignoring them and crapping all over them. Now, that congressperson, as you know, will swear up and down that he loves the undocumented folks and is here to protect them against the evil blah, blah, blahs. And I hope that's true. But I personally kind of have my doubts because of the incentive structure. So I hope you see we're not, I want to make very clear, I am not comparing the plight of slaves to the plight of undocumented immigrants because I think that would be completely morally and intellectually absurd and incoherent and stupid. I'm not saying they're in a similar situation at all. I want to be very clear about that. What I'm saying is there's a history in this country of politicians cynically counting people to give them, the politicians, more power and then ignoring those people completely because they can't vote. And in a republic, we're not supposed to have a system like that, right? A republic is supposed to be full of citizens who can hold their representatives accountable. And unfortunately, we have a history of kind of these loopholes where that isn't really the spirit of what we're doing. All right, so like I said, I'm going to pause there because next second half of this unit is going to be kind of taking a turn into the Bill of Rights, and that's kind of a standalone topic. So one that I look forward to, and I will see you next time.